Hi, this is Professor Favors with the lecture Are Protests Obsolete? So this is for the argumentative essay. This essay is usually for the English 1302. That is the second course in the first year composition sequence, and it is next to the very last paper, the formal research paper on the correlation between poverty and population control. This paper also serves as the module 4, which is connected to module 2. Module 2 is where the students, where I have my students create a working annotated bibliography of different protest movement organizations. So by the time they get to module 4, which is Are Protests Obsolete? They are prepared for the research topic, and then they are now going to synthesize their essay or the content within their essay on a particular question. Are protests obsolete? So this is Are Protests Obsolete, the argumentative essay. And this discussion is going to include not only concepts that are specific to determining whether or not protests are obsolete or not obsolete, but also argument basics such as claim, counterclaim, evidence, and rebuttal, and also look at certain organizations. This lecture also is coordinated with the audio version of the English assignment sheet and any of the source materials that may also offer an audio version as well. So this is Our Protest Obsolete, the argumentative essay. So I need to give a quick um, fair use disclaimer. We no longer utilize books directly with the course, but the information that I take in terms of quoted material comes from this previous course text, Read, Reason, and Write for English 1302. So I am using some parts of the text, and you'll note the difference because there will be quotes around a particular source material um, um, for teaching purposes. So this is a fair use disclaimer. So, introduction, why study this topic? Why study the topic of protests, or why study the topic of movements, especially within a first year composition course? Usually, you might find this topic within a political science course, sociology course, maybe some psychology courses, but you ordinarily would not find this topic within a composition course, even if some of the literary references to Henry David Thoreau on civil disobedience is housed within the English discipline. It's important to study this topic because many people are interested in forming advocacy organizations. Many people are interested in contributing to protests and movements. But the most important thing you need to consider is, have you prepared? Does your decision coordinate with your own career aspirations? The first essay for our course is the career preparation essay, where students research their potential career objectives and sort of take into consideration their own views, their own vision for their lives, and whether or not any decisions they make afterwards will sort of either support or oppose um, their career objectives. So, this is important to understand why study this topic. So, effectiveness is key. Given the current political climate for protests and movements, it is no wonder how much effectiveness should be as the primary goal of pursuing cultural, social, political, and legislative changes. Protests and movements under multiple organizations have varying mission statements, as well as different guiding principles. The issues that these organizations face have their own struggle, as well as their well intentions. The question is this: how effective are these organizations in getting things done? Effectiveness is key, and it is implied in the following question: are protests obsolete? So it is important to study this topic because we should all be able to measure whether we are accomplishing individual and organizational goals. We should be purposeful and effective in what we put our hands to do. In other words, if an organization sets 3 annual goals to conduct a sit-in, conduct a protest, conduct a communication call, any of those goals, and they accomplish at least one of those goals, then yes, no, protests are not obsolete, right? But if you don't set any goals, or if you or all the goals that you have set you have not accomplished anything, then yes, protests are obsolete because you are not effective in the thing that you are trying to accomplish. Meaning that it all it all starts with you assessing the initial goal. So the audience for this lecture is primary in terms of English 1302 students, and these students also may be dual credit transfer students as well as university enrolled. The secondary would be just the general first year composition students, first year composition instructors, first year composition programs, first year teaching of writing programs, and then Centers for Teaching and Learning Online. So that's your secondary audience. So you as a student taking my course, you would be a primary audience. And all of your fellow peers, fellow students would be primary for this course. So this lecture extends the discussion on protest organizations from content that you developed composing a working annotated bibliography, and you are expected to use that content within your paper. This lecture will deliver the topic on the building blocks of argument. The purpose of the lecture is to teach you how to do the following: choose a position based on the topic and claims on the topic, support that position with appropriate evidence, substantiate your claims, meaning that you are creating quotes, integrating evidence using MLA formatting, and then build an argument using the building blocks of argument as a guide. So there is a difference between you creating a regular essay where you have a thesis and you're proving a thesis, and an argumentative essay where you are actually building an argument. So your learning objectives: by the end of the lecture, you will be able to assess and critically think about different claims on a topic. 2, by the end of the lecture, you will be able to draft a tentative position. 3, by the end of the lecture, you will be able to build an argument using the building blocks of argument. And then 4, by the end of the lecture, you will be able to write and sustain your argument using claims, evidence, and rebuttals. So this is your pre-lecture. You are usually required to respond to a discussion quick write or thinking routine. So this is your pre-lecture. So here is the discussion quick write, protests and movements. So consider the following pre-lecture questions. What is your knowledge about current protests and movements? And then that knowledge could be historical, recent, current, political, economic, business, financial, and religious issues. So a lot is a lot has been going on since the pandemic, especially with the 2020 George Floyd protests. So that is sort of our most recent knowledge of protests, other than anything, sort of standard status quo historical. And then we might have had protests sometime after that as well. But what is your knowledge about current protests and movements? So then the advocacy interest part of this discussion, quick right, will gauge your knowledge about advocacy. So what do you know about advocacy? How have you prepared for service in advocacy? What are your current plans for advocacy? Do you plan to coordinate your service in advocacy with your career? So think about these questions in terms of what it suggests about your goal orientation, learning goal versus performance goal. Because you, as I have noted in our classes multiple times, you got people who will join things but not have any clue about what the mission statement is for that organization, what the organization is about, have they accomplished any goals, anything like that. And so the learning goal orientation would be just you learning for learning's sake. You have an intrinsic motivation to learn about the issue, what the problem is, versus a performance goal orientation. Anyone out there marching and protesting, but have no knowledge of what is going on. They're just performing what looks like a knowledgeable person when they're not really a knowledgeable person. So pause here for a minute and just review those questions again for the discussion quick write and then compose your answers. So looking at learning goal orientation and performance goal orientation, we understand for the LGO the general belief uh, that abilities are malleable and can be developed, referred to as a mastery orientation. Think about growth mindset. You've been exposed to Dweck's changing our mindset chart, and so think about it as having a growth mindset. For performance goal orientation, that is the general belief that abilities are fixed and cannot be developed. So it's one of those types of people who says, I just can't do it. No matter how many times you try to encourage the individual to pursue it, they just feel like they can't do it. And so they will stress short-term results, right? They will see failure as weakness. And think about that in terms of fixed mindset. So for the thinking routine, sentence, phrase, word, it's essentially a way for you. It helps learners reflect on their thinking and how that thinking has shifted over time. Then help learners synthesize and explore new ideas, and then help learners transition from and balance lower order thinking of recall and rote memorization to higher order thinking of analysis, evaluation, and critical thinking. Very important because you want to get out of the memory recall of information into now critically thinking. And that's where you transition from what you used to do at the high school level, summary writing, to the first year composition course, which which requires you to have a thesis and integrate some evidence, right? But then to the second course, where you are really critically thinking, analysis, argumentative thinking, as much as evaluating and analyzing as well. So here's the thinking routine sentence, phrase, word. Here is the source. It is the Henry David Thoreau on the duty of civil disobedience, written 1849, 19th century. So I heartily accept the motto that government is best, which governs least. And I should like to see it acted up to more rapidly and systematically carried out. It finally amounts to this, which also I believe, that government is best, which governs not at all. And when men are prepared for it, that will be the kind of government which they will have. Government is at best but an expedient. But most governments are usually, and all governments are sometimes inexpedient. So essentially, he's saying that the government tends to make decisions too fast, and then there are some decisions that government does not make that are beneficial to the people, and that he's pushing for this idea that government should govern least. In some ways, if you think about it, there is the federal government, then a state government, and then your local government. And so what most people say, just in general, that the federal government should stay out of the marriage bed, or the federal government should not inhibit free speech, things like that, right? And so there are laws on the book which makes government expedient, meaning that there's this order by order way of running things, but then sometimes the order by order way of running things could make things inexpedient for people, meaning that if you have to protest or you want to protest, you have to go get a permit. That there's laws in a book that says you can protest and you do have free speech rights, but you just can't go out there and do whatever you want. That's inexpedient for you, even though the law is expedient in terms of permitting you to exercise your free speech. So when we think about that sentence, phrase, word thinking routine, which sentence was meaningful to you or you felt captured the core idea, which phrase moved you, engaged, or proved you, and which word captured your attention that struck you as powerful. So when we look at the particular passage again, what is suggested in this passage, right? And we still have the same questions that we're going to pose as thinking routine questions. So the best way to understand then is to understand the difference between expedient and inexpedient. Now, remember, this was published in 1849. We are in 2023. So how we look at these words, we still may be viewing them through the lens of a 21st century understanding, whereas that was a 19th century understanding of expedient and inexpedient. So do keep that in mind. You may want to take some time to look up the genealogy of that word as just a practice. But expedient meaning convenient, practical, possibly improper or immoral means of attaining an end, especially when considered convenient but immoral. Inexpedient meaning not suitable, not practical, not advisable, irresponsible. So Henry David Thoreau had a problem with slavery, and slavery was a solution at that time um, for economic reasons, right? Even though it was an immoral practice, or many people thought it was an immoral, it was an expedient in the sense that slave owners connected slavery to economic growth. So we need slavery, we need bodies, we need laborers to labor the field so that we can continue to grow as a country. So it was convenient, it was practical, but it was definitely immoral, right? And so then the inexpedient part of it, meaning that it wasn't suitable. So even though you think as a slave owner, a business owner, a capitalist, that slavery is what we need to continue doing, it is not suitable, not practical, not advisable, irresponsible long term. That you can't have slaves forever, even if you believe you have title property to individuals and their generations forever. As a country, we cannot grow with slavery. And so it's irresponsible for you to adopt this colonization view in perpetuity, meaning that forever, right? People do have rights to their own bodies, to their own persons. You can't live in America that says it's free when there's a class of people who are not free. So that's the difference between expedient and inexpedient. So then what is suggested? So for the expedient aspect of it, when you read it again, I heartily accept the motto that government is best which governs least. Government is at best but an expedient. So government is convenient. It is practical. It does have some immoral attributes, but it is a means of attaining an end, meaning that we have colonized all these different people, brought them over to America, stole the land, so to speak, and now we're going to enact laws so that we can maintain control. Well, that is convenient. That is practical. It does have some immoral aspects to it, but it was a means of attaining an end, meaning that we are now going to control the land, or we're going to control the government through enactment of laws. So then the inexpedient aspect, but most governments are usually, and all governments are sometimes inexpedient, meaning that the means to the end has some immoral qualities. We want to leave um, Europe, or we want to leave from another continent and go to another continent and create our own laws and have our own country, leave the mother country and become our own country. And we're going to do that by taking people from their land. Well, that's inexpedient. That's not suitable, not practical, it should not be advisable. It's irresponsible because you are separating families. You are separating people from their culture, their ethnicity, their nationality, and bringing them over into another land where they don't know the language. And as much as you want to think that this is going to work long term, and it did, it worked for hundreds of years. But eventually, that decision has to burn out because you cannot hold people forever. You cannot enslave people forever. And so then it's irresponsible because now we sort of we live in a country with a ruling class, white, but that same country and same white people always have to deal with people who are non-white, and I always have to deal with the views and protests and movements from non-white. And so you don't really, in some ways, you don't really own the country that you thought you owned. And so you have to participate in a democratic way in order to get anything done. You just can't rule and that be it, right? And so your decision to leave one country and come over to another was might have been convenient, but it's also inconvenient at the same time. It might have been expedient, but it's also inexpedient. So Henry David Thoreau, born in Concord, Massachusetts, he was an American essayist, poet, practical philosopher, lived the doctrines of transcendentalism, which was a 19th century movement of writers and philosophers in New England who were bound together by the belief in the unity of creation, the innate goodness of humanity, and the supremacy of insight over logic. Vigorous advocate of civil liberties, dedicated abolitionist, harsh indictment against slavery, helped to speed fleeing slaves, lectured and wrote against slavery, titled Slavery in Massachusetts. And then he published the work that we just referenced, Civil Disobedience in 1849. So he was definitely an abolitionist. He was against slavery. And so what you see in that piece in Civil Disobedience is his way of balancing the discussion between government being expedient and government being inexpedient. Government being expedient, let's use this particular tool, slavery, to get what we need to get done as a means to an end to get something done. But the inexpedient aspect of it is that you are taking bodies, you are stealing bodies, you are beating bodies, you are enslaving bodies, as well as their generations for your expedient reasons. And so that he called that basically immoral and inexpedient. And so he refused to support a government that endorsed slavery. He also refused to support a government that waged an imperialist war against Mexico. And then he defended the private individual conscience against the expediency of the majority. And then he believed that there was a higher law than a civil one. So basically, he's suggesting that there is a theocracy over a democracy, whereas the people at that time valued a democracy only if it applied to uh, say the owners of America at that time, the colonists, right? Um, but democracy sort of lowers the value in a sense that now you have to be subject to a democratic way of doing things. So now they have pushed out completely the theocracy aspect of it, except for ceremonial reasons, and push the democracy, which now allows for the freeing of slaves. So let's conduct a knowledge check. So, what is your knowledge about current protests and movements? What do you know about advocacy? How has your learning shifted over time concerning protests and advocacy? What are your specific views on civil disobedience? So, when you think about the 2020 protest, the George Floyd protest, how does that have an impact on your thinking about um, protests and movements, right? How does that have an impact on your ability to balance your understanding with civil disobedience? Because civil disobedience can still be under a permit of law, meaning that you went to your local government, paid for a permit in order to protest on the streets, right? But it's still considered civil disobedience in the sense that it is going against the status quo, and the status quo really are the laws on the book. So keep this in mind. So your writing prompt is about the thesis, task management, and use of required sources. So make sure to read the English assignment sheet. There should be an audio version of it. I might need to do another one, but your English assignment sheet, which is on the topic of protest, so make sure to read that prompt. You are required to build an argument in 3 to 4 pages. This means that you must choose a position and then you have those required sources that are housed on eCampus. So when you're trying to form a thesis to a question prompt, the prompt that has a question in it, and it's this type of prompt, right? It's the obsolete argument. In my English 1301 class, I have another obsolete argument. I think it's the final paper for that English 1301, and it is Are single-sex colleges obsolete, right? And so for this, it's the same strategy. You are answering whether it's a yes or no answer, and you are choosing one, and then you are using the other side as a counter. So if this is a yes answer, yes, protests are obsolete. They are no longer viable political tools to bring about long lasting legislative changes. Today, they are cut off from the arguments of our histories. And a no answer, protests are not obsolete. They are still necessary as political tools to bring about long lasting legislative changes. They extend the arguments of our histories, meaning that if you say protests are obsolete, in some ways you're saying we no longer need whatever it was that we were using prior in terms of historical information. We don't need that anymore because we are cutting off protests altogether. 2023 is the last time we're going to have protests. But if you say, no, protests are not obsolete, that means that you are combining your efforts from previous protests and movements as insight for what you need to do today. And that today could mean or could begin 2023. That's why it's very important that you study protests. If you're going to go out and advocate, and do anything, you need to study the history of that issue. You need to study the history of that cause. Study the history of the beliefs, surrounding an issue. When you are protesting, you are suggesting that your protest is a solution to the problem. So the real question is, do you understand the problem? Once you understand the problem, and the problem can be multifaceted, if you only think protests are enough to solve the problem, then it means you don't have true insight about the problem. There are always different solutions for one problem, even though there is at least one answer for a problem. So, in managing your tasks, right, you're going to research one or more protests, okay? And then refer to your working annotated bibliography from Module 2. You may use any content from that bibliography. Note that you cannot submit that bibliography now for points, of course. And then outline an argument based on your position regarding the um, the necessity of protest today. And then create, build, and sustain. Create an argumentative thesis, build an argument, balance diversity of viewpoints, synthesize the topic, sustain your position. So by the time, whatever you start off saying at the beginning or writing at the beginning, yes answer, yes, protests are obsolete. You can counter however way you want to counter in the middle, but by the end of your essay and your conclusion, you must end on that position. Yes, protests are obsolete, right? If you begin with a no, protests are not obsolete. Anything that's in the middle is going to be a yes answer. So then by the end of the essay, your position should end on a no. No, protests are not obsolete. Okay, so are protests obsolete? So these are your required sources. There's the Gretchen Carlson's My Fight Against Sexual Harassment was initially in the textbook referenced earlier in this lecture. It is not available for the current essay, so note the change in eCampus. My Fight Against Sexual Harassment is an article that is available online, but it requires a subscription to one of the online articles. Then there's the Pew Research Center information, then one organizational reference, so an advocacy organization, one legislation document, such as the Texas Senate Bill 18, that is a free speech, campus free speech type document, and then one special topic. And that could be anything from teacher walkouts, campus free speech, anything like that. So the lecture, the building blocks of argument, academic versus argumentative. So there are some distinctions. We understand that an academic essay, all essays have an introduction and conclusion paragraph. All essays have body paragraphs. However, what you do in an academic essay is different from what you do in an argumentative essay. So the academic essay, you are proving your thesis. The topic sentences support the thesis statement. Supporting evidence supports the topic sentence. Examples, facts, data, quotes, paraphrases all support the supporting evidence. And then everything is formatted in MLA for English, and then there's a conclusion paragraph. But for the argumentative essay, same strategy in terms of um, introduction, but you are creating an arguable thesis statement. You also have body paragraphs. Some body paragraphs could have some academic essay parts to it, but essentially you are building an argument. So what's the claim, counterclaim, evidence, and rebuttal? And remember, evidence can be used for the claim, the counterclaim, or the rebuttal. The most important aspect of this, in terms of building an argumentative essay, is to end on your position, which is your rebuttal. If you end on the counterclaim, that means you have lost your argument, right? So that's why you want to check what you write in the beginning and what you write in the end. And then, of course, there is the conclusion paragraph. And the supporting evidence does what supporting evidence does. Is in it falls under multiple categories, and how you use it will determine how well you build and sustain your argument. So the argumentative essay. The argumentative essay requires you to take a position and support that position with appropriate evidence. The argumentative essay requires you to begin and end on your position. This means that if you believe protests are obsolete, then you are not only required to build an argument, but also end on your argument by the end of the essay, not simply just in one paragraph or section. The argumentative essay requires you to sustain your position while balancing and critically thinking about other claims. All research and sources reflect claims on the topic. So, in other words, every word written on a topic or written, published, or whatever represents claims on the topic. This person says this about protests, this person says this about protests, whatever it is. However, how you build the argument will determine whether that is a claim or a counterclaim or evidence or rebuttal. It just depends on where you place it within your essay. So building blocks: claim, what the argument asserts or attempts to prove; counterclaim and opposing claim; evidence, information used to support a claim or counterclaim or rebuttal; and then the rebuttal, a statement used to contradict evidence or a counterclaim. Prove it wrong, meaning that your rebuttal should by the end of your essay essentially prove the counterclaim wrong. So choosing a position, this is information taken directly from the course text. So the position paper makes a claim about what is right or wrong, good or bad, for us as individuals or as a society. A successful position paper requires more than a forceful statement of personal beliefs. If we can reason logically from principles widely shared by our audience, we are more likely to be successful. If we're going to challenge their beliefs or values, then we need to consider the conciliatory approach as a strategy for getting them to at least listen to our argument. So it just depends on what you are proposing and choosing as a position within your paper. But there always has to be some form of balance, and that's why I think that term conciliatory is there, that there are some things you are going to have to agree on, meaning that, for instance, when it comes to protests, you can't say, well, I don't need a permit. I don't see why I need a permit. If I want to protest, I want to protest. But that's not the law. There are some things that we're going to have to concede on and say, okay, we're going to have to agree with. The law says if I want to protest, then I have to have a permit, right? And I need to go down, pay the fee, get a permit, and then I can form a protest. That is the conciliatory aspect of a certain belief or value connected to protests and movements. And when I operate outside of that boundary of permits, then I can't be mad when I am arrested because I'm operating outside the bounds of free speech, even if the Constitution says I have the right to free speech. So choosing a position consideration. So protests are obsolete versus protests are not obsolete. So protests are obsolete. If you believe that protests are obsolete and you qualify your claim based on the goals of the organization to bring awareness, right? You will see this in mission statements a lot. And the organization fulfills that goal, then you may find it challenging to prove or sustain your argument. The evidence would be obvious, especially if they do a great job of bringing awareness. Protests are not obsolete. If you believe that protests are not obsolete and you qualify your claim based on the goals of the organization to bring awareness, and the organization fulfills that goal, then you are likely to find substantial supporting evidence to prove and or sustain your argument, but not enough information for critical thinking. Meaning, you're missing some aspect of the critical thinking that you need to determine whether or not protests are not obsolete. Some things still may be status quo. And I mean, if you have an organization, the same goals they keep meeting every year, they are missing the mark somewhere, right? And so if they're saying that we're still necessary, that's what protests are not obsolete, that we're still necessary. Okay, so how are you qualifying that information? Because I don't see change. You've been in business, what, for 5 years, and you still haven't brought about any change, right? So we need some more uh, than just, you know, we're here to provide resources. We can get resources anywhere. We need much more than that. What are you actually doing in the community? How has someone been changed as a result of your organizational agenda? Here are your guidelines for also choosing a position. So identify the writer's claim. What is the author's arguments? Assess the facts the author presents. So do they read credible? Does the author provide a source or the facts relevant to their or your argument? Outline the reasons the author provides. Do the reasons support the author's argument or the general claim on the topic? What are the underlying assumptions? And then decide if you are convinced. Are you convinced by the author's argument? Is the evidence strong enough to change your position or maintain your position? In this case, you are researching online organizations, and so most of their information is housed on a website, and they're not necessarily considered author unless there is an individual who writes an article for the website. So you could change author to organizers or author to founders or author to organization. What is the organization's argument, right? And you can find the organization's argument in their mission statement. And that mission statement could serve as a thesis in your English paper. And so change author to tailor author to fit the actual research. So if we're choosing a position, here's the guidelines example and question. So here it is. We have Black Lives Matter because Black Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter because Blue Lives Matter, White Lives Matter because White Lives Matter, All Lives Matter because it is obvious, right? So what is convincing about these arguments? Some are counter arguments to a current argument, but the rebuttal is inherent in All Lives Matter. Do any of the other claims arguments lose value because of the obvious rebuttal? So if you sort of wear a shirt, All Lives Matter, well, everybody knows that. If we live in a system where the ruling class is white and they say white lives matter, why would they need a t-shirt for that? That's already obvious, right? That's not even it's an ultimate rebuttal because of the system that we live in. Even if this was not a white ruling class, say we lived in Japan, well, the Japanese would be the obvious rebuttal. I can't go over there as an African American and say all lives matter or Black lives matter over there in Japan because Japan or the Japanese represent the ruling class. So at the end of the day, they are the ultimate rebuttal. So they don't need Japanese Lives Matter as a T-shirt. They don't need to put that up as a banner. They don't need that as a flag. Their country's flag is already serving as the ultimate rebuttal. So that means I have to come up under their organization, their laws, federal, state, local, if they refer to their laws in that way, in those three categories, and I have to submit to their culture, way of life, nationality, ethnicity, race, whatever it is that you want to call it, and label it. I I have to know their laws about protesting. I can't just take down a banner. If you remember the North Korean situation, where the student from University of Virginia visited North Korea on a school trip, and in his hotel room, he took down the propaganda banner. There's a propaganda banner that's specific, I think, to honoring the country's president, owner, or whatever. And so everyone in that country is required, if even if their house is burning, to take that picture and save that picture, right? And so anything that represents a propaganda banner in our eyes is not a propaganda banner in their eyes. It is honor. You leave that up. So he took it down, and then he was um, further arrested, and then they held him for some time, and then something happened with his consciousness, and then they went on ahead and transported him back to America, where he later died. But he thought that he could take his American sensitivities and American way of life and cultural understanding over there to another country and protest, even if it was indirectly, because he thought that our democracy laws overruled their autocracy laws. And so you have to understand, when you are protesting or making any decisions about a protest, that you understand the problem, you understand the laws. It's not a problem for them, but he came over from another country making it a problem, and therefore they had to create a solution, which was jail and try him jail or whatever, and then he ended up dying. So that's something that you want to be careful of. So now let's check what are the building blocks of argument. What is the difference between an academic essay and an argumentative essay? Why is it important to identify the authors or authors' claims before taking a position? Why is the rebuttal for your position significant? Meaning that they ultimately rebutted the UVA student over there in North Korea by charging him and threatening to imprison him. That was their ultimate rebuttal. Their country believes in this honor. When you come over there, you can have all the counter arguments you want in your head, but you can't voice them. And then if you do, they're going to, their counterclaim is to charge you and convict you and throw you into prison. And if you die, you die. And that's the ultimate rebuttal, because when he was transported to the US, he lived for a good minute, and then he died, right? And so that's why you want to know about what the problem is, what's going on with a particular protest or advocacy issue, so that you can provide an appropriate, timely solution. So pause here, go ahead and review the knowledge check again. Know the difference between proving a thesis and building an argument. So composition strategies, drafting, assessing, revising, and this is before the full paper. So when you are drafting position, introduce. So as you draft your position based on the writing prompt, begin by introducing the topic in a paragraph. To introduce, you must know the topic. This means read the required sources and any additional sources you are considering. Create and organize your claims. You must have a good understanding of the arguments or claims on the topic to determine where a claim might fit. So it might really be a good idea to create like a table and put as a top the um, say do each individual source first, So that will be the title, the author's name, what the author's thesis is, what are the claims on the topic, any counterclaims the author uses within his work, and then does the author actually end on his rebuttal. And then a larger table with all of the sources with the same title, the same categories, column categories, author, title of work, claim, author's thesis, claim, counterclaim, evidence, and rebuttal. And that'll give you some kind of way to see how you think, what is written on a topic, and then where you might fit. And then defend, provide a logical logical defense of your claims using appropriate evidence. So drafting your position example. So protests around the country focus on women's rights, sexual harassment, and the lives of Black men and women. But protests today are not as effective and or efficiently argued because they do not transition into pursuit of legislation. Many people join protests without understanding the issues. It is difficult to measure whether they have a viable argument. Likewise, protest and advocacy organizations are good at bringing awareness of issues that but need work in corralling protesters and activists on the ground to bring about long-lasting legislative change. That's why I believe protests are obsolete. So that's your thesis. There's the setup of the topic, and then there's the thesis. So now create, organize. Your goal is to locate information that supports your claim. Protesters are unaware of issues, and organizations need help in educating protesters and ushering their actions leading to legislative changes. So these are the two issues that you feel need to be addressed within your paper. Then defend your argument that protests are obsolete unless the research and statistics suggest otherwise, or unless you can develop an effective rebuttal despite the research and statistics. And so you would have to find if the research and statistics suggest that protests are still important and that they're not obsolete, and there's really good data and information about that, then you would have to find the kind of scholarship, government documents, crime statistics, anything connected to a specific protest or movement that made the protest or movement sort of ineffective, meaning that the people started out with one thing, but because of the looting or crime or something like that, it made it sort of obsolete, ineffective. So your position and introduction. So um, let me read it. So protests around the country focus on women's rights, sexual harassment, and the lives of Black men and women. But protests today are not as effective and are efficiently argued because they rarely transition into pursuit of legislation. Many people join protests without understanding the issues. It is difficult to measure whether they have an argument for change. So the first was just an outline, was just a sort of like a pre-draft. So likewise, protest and advocacy organizations are good at bringing awareness of issues, but need work in corralling protesters and activists on the ground to bring about long-lasting legislative change. That's why I believe protests are obsolete. This argumentative essay explores claims of protesters and protest organizations and assesses the research and statistics on the topic. Despite evidence and statistics, it is arguable that in the current climate protests are necessary for bringing about long-lasting change. Protests are obsolete. So moving from first person I to third person, protests are obsolete, is a much more academic way of introducing a thesis. So assessing, determine cause and effects or arguments about cause or causal arguments explain past events and current situations, and they also predict the future. Determine the cause of an event. Causal arguments outline an agent, so that could be a person, a situation, or another event that led to the effect. And then determine conditions. Causal arguments may be remote, proximate, or precipitating. So something could have created the issue, could have triggered the cause to create the effect. So in assessing questions Black Lives Matter, determine cause and effect. What was the cause that led to the effect of founding Black Lives Matter? And how will BLM have an impact on future protest movements? Okay. Determine a cause of an event. What person, situation, or another event led to the effect of founding Black Lives Matter as an organization? And then conditions. What was the precipitating event that led to the founding of Black Lives Matter? What triggered the organization's founding? So this is just three different ways to figure out what was the cause effect, what was maybe a person or situation, and then what was the precipitating event. So if we look at the same questions again, the answers would be the acquittal of George Zimmerman in his shooting of 17-year-old Trayvon Martin is what led three black women to found Black Lives Matter as an international organization. That's your cause and effect. One thing happened and then another. Cause of an event. George Zimmerman shot an unarmed Trayvon Martin, claiming self-defense due to a physical altercation with Martin. Okay, and then conditions. The precipitating event was the acquittal and the fact that no additional charges were filed due to alleged civil rights violations. So those are your conditions surrounding the founding of Black Lives Matter. That's your cause of an event surrounding the founding of Black Lives Matter, and then cause effect surrounding the founding of Black Lives Matter. So, critical thinking opportunity. The last sentence from the previous slide represents a critical thinking opportunity. So, the fact that there was an acquittal and no additional charges due to alleged civil rights violations. If it is difficult to gain significant ground on getting a conviction for Zimmerman, then the next level of protest strategy would be to focus on the fact that the courts refused to pursue additional charges based on alleged civil rights violations. So, in other words, if you can't get Zimmerman on the federal part, maybe you can get him on the civil part, and then that sort of brings civil under state law. And then if you don't have pursuit of civil rights violations, which is really federal, if you don't have pursuit of civil rights violations at the federal level, and then maybe you're not having it at the state level, then you might be able to sue based upon civil uh, penalties, right? But it seems like civil rights violations was not in play. So why weren't Trayvon Martin's civil rights violated? Meaning, why couldn't the courts or why couldn't the attorneys argue for civil rights? Why wasn't the civil rights legislation useful for making a case against Zimmerman? Because remember, we have civil rights legislation on the books. So why is it that we could not apply the law to this particular issue? And then these two questions will allow protest and advocacy organizations to focus their efforts on legislative changes and not merely adding more options to their current roster of strategies. This would require more study and preparation. So this then is the problem. It's not just that Zimmerman shot an unarmed person. It's also, but also the fact that we can't apply the civil rights legislation to this particular issue, and why can't we? And that's something that's going to require further study. So, revising, you do not need to revise facts provided you obtain information appropriately using reputable sources, content that is direct from the organization. So, you should not be using sources that talk about Time's Up or Blue Lives Matter. Oh, I'm sorry, Black Lives Matter or Me Too. You should go directly to their websites. However, you will always need to revise the ordering of facts, content, and claims and arguments. How you understand the information will be reflected in the paper. You will always need to revise for cause and for effect to determine when something happens and why it has produced an effect. So you don't need to revise facts as long as you integrated them appropriately, of course. But you do need to make sure that when you are revising, you revise based upon the order of that information. And then we need to always know what the cause is, a clear understanding of the cause before we can even approach the effect. So, Black Lives Matter revising for clarity. creating a prep statement. Black Lives Matter is a Black-centered political will and movement building project. 3 Black organizers formed the organization in response to the acquittal of George Zimmerman in the Trayvon Martin shooting. Today, BLM operates with a different vision. So now we are going to revise for current mission. Today, Black Lives Matter builds local power and intervenes in violence inflicted on Black communities by the state and vigilantes. The organization focuses its efforts on Black liberation, affirming the lives of Black, queer, and trans folks, and affirming humanity. So it has moved from studying the Trayvon Martin shooting and sort of failing to address the civil rights violation aspect of that information to now focusing on building local power, intervening when violence is afflicted on Black communities, pushing for Black liberation, and then also affirming the lives of Black, queer, trans folks, and affirming humanity. So these are different goals, and that's why you have to revise for consistency. So, how important is it to introduce your position before building an argument? How important is it to understand the cause and effect of a particular protest incident? And what is at least one missed opportunity that Black Lives Matter could have challenged to support their larger argument for Black Lives Matter? And I think it's the civil rights. I think it's where you have Dr. Martin Luther King pushing for civil rights and pushing for civil rights legislation. The application of civil rights legislation has had its bumps in the road. That's the problem. It's not the problem is not does not need the solution to get out there and march and vote. I mean, march and protest. The problem is to look at is to extend the argument that Dr. King put forward about civil rights legislation, and civil rights equal application of the law. Now you are in the process of understanding that we have to have equal application of the law. That's what the Equal Protection Clause is. And so, how is it that civil rights uh, vi- violation can apply to one case, but not to the case with Zimmerman and the Trayvon Martin shooting? So, critical thinking strategies, exploring the claims arguments. This is still before the full paper. And this is the Gretchen Carlson. So remember, my fight against sexual harassment, you can still type that in as a keyword search because it is still an article, and it was an article that was housed in the initial textbook, and it is online, but it will require a subscription, I think, to the New York Times or any other online magazine. So the content on the next slides refers to information and page numbering from a previous textbook on the topic. You yourself need to refer to the online reading to meet the essay requirement. But if you are still interested in this topic as a general listener, just type in that title, pay the subscription cost, and then you should be able to access that article. So when we look at Gretchen Carlson, there was an issue with Gretchen Carlson in sexual harassment, right? And so we have Gretchen Carlson as an ethos or speaker, and we have also the appeal that she makes within the article, pathos. So Gretchen Carlson provides personal experiences with sexual harassment. So a cameraman wanted to know what it felt like to have the microphone touching her breast. She was sexually harassed after being crowned Miss America, and then a publicist forced her head into his crotch. So if she's speaking on this issue of sexual harassment, she is providing 3 major examples of when she experienced sexual harassment. So that makes her credible as a speaker, or her ethos is credible. So then she makes an emotional appeal, a pathos. Women who report are labeled as troublemakers. Women who report are not to be believed. And then women who report are forced to sign non-disclosure agreements. So this is something that was part of the Time's Up movement as well as the Me Too movement. And Time's Up is about sexual harassment. Um, and then Me Too is about sexual violence, right? Resolving both issues. And so now she's telling you that she could have solved her problem much earlier, But women, when they're trying to move within their careers, if they make trouble, right, um, according to the system, then they will be labeled as troublemakers. And then women are not always believed when they do report. And when they do report and there's a decision uh, brought down, it is of one that requires them to sign a non-disclosure agreement. So they can't even talk about their issue. So then she uses supporting evidence within her article. According to the National Women's Law Center, almost half of all women have been sexually harassed at work. So she's giving you credible evidence from an actual national organization. And then she makes references. Comedian Heather McDonald reported being sexually harassed. A flight attendant reported sexual harassment. Tenured religious teacher reported sexual harassment. And then an Iraq war veteran reported sexual harassment. So these are references that she makes within an article. And this means that she is staying on the point of her article, of, of, of her purpose for writing, right? So not only is she bringing in her personal experience, and she's bringing in what the solution issues with how the industry wants a particular type of solution, but she's also bringing you in national information from a credible organization. Then she's bringing in references. So now she's offering proposals to the problem. So companies should not be able to force employees to sign contracts that house an arbitration clause. Arbitration does not favor the accuser. Victims of harassment should have their day in court where rules of evidence and civil procedure is permitted. Court rules do not apply to arbitration. Sexual harassment training should be reassessed as well as the role of human resources to guard against bias. And then we need to socialize our boys and girls, teaching them the value of respect for others. And at the end of the day, it is just about respect, right? So she gets into the concrete solution that arbitration is does not allow for someone to really speak on their own behalf, right? Um, and so she's really pushing for this idea that we need to go the court route versus the arbitration route. But when you sign your contracts with a major organization, especially when you are going to be in an administrative role or any other type of high role, high powered position, you usually have to sign an NDA, and you usually have to agree to arbitration if something happens with the company. So that's why she's pushing for this idea that we need to move arbitration to the side and allow for victims of sexual harassment to pursue court procedures so that a judge can actually decide the case. So let's look at how we should outline her argument. So there's a claim: I want to do everything I can to end sexual harassment in the working place. That is her argumentative thesis. It seems simple enough, but it is a very powerful one to think about. Evidence: women are consistently harassed in the workplace. List of examples, and those are those examples that we mentioned earlier. Then evidence again, National Women's Law Center report, almost half of all women have been sexually harassed at work. Then we have a counter argument on the topic, which is the standard one. Women are not believed and are accused of being troublemakers. They're not really harassed. Arbitration works better. Then the ultimate rebuttal would be, although reporting may contribute to trouble, use of the public court system is more appropriate to resolving sexual harassment. And that rebuttal goes back to what her initial claim is about. I want to do everything I can to end sexual harassment. So if we go the court route and not the arbitration route and not the NDA route, then we will be able to resolve this issue of sexual harassment in the workplace. So let's summarize. The workplace sexual harassment is prevalent in society, especially during 2016, when Gretchen Carlson was forced to adopt a stance to do all that she could to end sexual harassment. In My Fight Against Sexual Harassment, Carlson argues that sexual harassment is predicated on a belief of entitlement. Males believe in the right to pursue harassment. Carlson outlines several examples of women who reported sexual harassment. So you can add examples here. And uses evidence from the National Women's Law Center to support the argument of women who are sexually harassed. Carlson proposes that victims of harassment deserve access to the public courts, a right not afforded in arbitration. There must be a change in how we raise our boys and girls. So that's basically a summary of her whole argument. So when we're thinking about the MLA concept and online article, we want to gather, review, format, and refer. So gather the online reading for Gretchen Carlson, housed on eCampus. Review it to understand the author, title of work, and title of website information, format according to MLA, and then refer to the Purdue OWL link and downloadable document under MLA topics for how to format the author's article. So knowledge check, why is the experience and knowledge of the speaker important for supporting the larger argument? So if you're going to march and protest and start a movement, it does matter whether or not you have the uh, previous experiences with that subject matter. If you're just going out there just to support someone else, nothing wrong with that, but you don't have a real true understanding of what that person went through. So ethos does matter. How does an author's ethos help to support a proposal for change? Meaning that the fact that Gretchen Carlson experienced this herself in multiple ways throughout her career journey suggests that her ethos does help to support proposal for change, because those were different contexts and different jobs. And then ultimately the one job that she ended up having to sue. And then why is it important to ensure that the rebuttal aligns with the argument and the thesis, meaning that it's important because you need to just end on your own argument. So Pew Research Center, Activism in the Social Media Age. This is your online article. And so we have this page here that you will see once you click the link from eCampus, Activism in the Social Media Age. And then the use of hashtag. So they focus on the use of hashtag and how much social media influence it had, right? So the use of hashtag Black Lives Matter. There's the archetype of modern protests and political engagement on social media. The hashtag used in public tweets nearly 30 million times on Twitter, which was an average of 17,000 times. And then the use of the hashtag on Twitter spiked, triggering response to major news events. And use of hashtag includes conversations centered on race, violence, law enforcement, police-related deaths of Alton Sterling, Philando Castile, shooting of police officers, and Dallas and Baton Rouge. So that one hashtag, use of that one hashtag on social media, specifically Twitter, had this result. So there was one thing led to another and then to another, right? And then along with Me Too and MAGA sparked larger conversations of use of social media as a viable medium for political engagement and social activism. Survey results from the Pew Research Center suggest that these sites and social media tools are useful for getting politicians to pay attention to issues. Because once you have so many numbers, once you get into the high numbers of using this particular hashtag as a social media influence on protests and movements, you're going to get many people looking at this. So 69% of Americans feel these platforms are important. 67 of Americans feel these platforms are important for creating sustained movement for social change. So they're basically suggesting that we have moved from merely marching and protesting and getting hosed down and arrested to now operating from a computer and from a phone and from a laptop, um, basically from technology to bring about change and to bring about sustained change. So use of social media for political engagement. So roughly half of Black social media users find social media platforms personally important for expressing their political views, getting involved with issues that are important to them. So that means that they feel empowered. A third of white social media users believe that social media is useful for expressing their political views, and or getting involved with issues important to them. Again, they feel empowered. So, public views on social media hashtags for political activism. So, 64% suggest that social media gives a voice to underrepresented groups. 77% suggest that social networking sites distract people from issues that are truly important. 71% suggest that social media makes people believe they're making a difference when they really aren't. And then larger majority of Black Americans suggest sites promote important issues. Smaller shares of Black Americans suggest that political engagement on social media encourages a distracted public or slacktivism, which um, we will discuss. But I think that that fourth box here, 71% suggests that social media makes people believe they're making a difference when they really aren't, is something that you should consider. And then consider it in connection to the slacktivism reference here, because the person who goes out and march and protest on foot could easily be perceived as someone who thinks he or she is making a difference when he or she is not making a difference, right? Because if we still have police brutality, police violence, okay, something has not changed. Someone's understanding has not changed. If we have a person who is yelling taser, taser, taser while holding an actual gun, something is going on, something is missed. Then the slacktivism is it's just much easier to operate from a technology device than to go out and actually do the hard work. And that's the perception of someone who decides to march and protest. So slacktivism defined, actions taken to bring about political or social change, but requiring only minimal commitment effort. So students engaging in slacktivism by signing an online petition, which is referred to as armchair activism. So when you are formatting for electronic sources, also just remember the Purdue OWL, and this is the formatted source. Be sure that when you add this to your works cited page that you change the access date. Knowledge check. So how does use of a social media hashtag encourage and promote political engagement? Why do some social media users find Black Lives Matter or Blue Lives Matter or White Lives Matter useful for sparking larger conversations about race and social activism? And that's with the hashtag. And are you a slacktivist or an armchair activist? So organization, you are required to bring in an organization. So you must choose from one of the organizations to build and sustain your argument. So that's Me Too, Time's Up, Black Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter, All Lives Matter. You already have a working annotated bibliography for Me Too, Black Lives Matter, the article from Blue Lives Matter. So then you would only have to, um, if you chose to go the Time's Up route, you would have to create the content for that. And then the All Lives Matter route, you would have to create the content for that. So as you critically read, be sure to note the strategy in the language. Some organizations will use language such as intervene and or prevent or similar keywords. Always review mission statements. Remember that prevention refers to activities and strategies that come before the event, and intervention refers to activities and strategies that come after the event. So remember prevention as before, intervention as after. So required sources for the mission statement. So our vision for under Me Too, our vision from the beginning was to address both the dearth in resources for survivors of um, sexual violence and to build a community of advocates driven by survivors who will be at the forefront of creating solutions to interrupt sexual violence in their communities. So does that represent an intervention? And then Time's Up by helping change culture, companies and laws. Time's Up now aims to create a society free of gender-based discrimination in the workplace and beyond. We want every person across race, ethnicity, religion, sexuality, gender identity, and income level to be safe on the job and have equal opportunity for economic success and security. Our three goals are safety, power, and equity. So does times up push a prevention strategy? And then Black Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter. So the Black Lives Matter Global Network is a chapter-based, member-led organization whose mission is to build local power and intervene in violence inflicted on Black communities by the state and vigilantes. Is that an intervention purpose? And I think to myself, when I wrote this, when I pulled this together, I said, so there is no violence prevention. And then Blue Lives Matter, our mission to raise awareness and enlist the public's aid for the needs of police officers, to help police officers and assist each other, to provide a police officer's family with comfort and support as they go through hard times. So is this an intervention method? Is this to intervene or prevent? And then Black Lives Matter, the Black Lives Matter Global Network is a chapter-based, member-led organization whose mission is to build local power and to intervene in violence inflicted on Black communities by the state and vigilantes. And then All Lives Matter. All Lives Matter is a slogan that has come to be associated with criticism of the Black Lives Matter. The slogan became a large talking point in the 2016 United States presidential election. So does All Lives Matter create a prevention or intervention? But we do know that Blue Lives Matter and All Lives Matter are counter or represent counter arguments to Black Lives Matter. So when you are formatting the electronic sources, always remember how to do that using Purdue OWL. And then this is a recap of the Pew Research Center. Just remember to change the access date. And then your MLA works cited entries for Black Lives Matter. Just make sure that you understand that the link must match the title of work. So we understand that we are looking for this information on the About page or the About tab. And so once we click that and we get to that page, it's going to give you the proper link. The same can be said of the Me Too movement, and then equity for Times Up information. And then, of course, remember the Blue Lives Matter article. Just remember to change the access dates. Okay, so now let's check how important are the arguments for prevention and intervention. How important is it for an organization to define clearly its purpose to prevent and or intervene in protest-related activities? And how important is it for an organization to define clearly its purpose for managing efforts leading to legislative changes? So legislation, Texas Senate Bill 18, free speech legislation. And so you are required to have this in your paper. So campus free speech, which is public. Public institutions of higher education must recognize freedom of speech as a fundamental right. Protected expression includes the following. So this is kind of small, but hopefully you can read it. Recognition, registration with an institution of higher education. Use of institution of higher education's facilities for meetings and or speaking purposes. Use of channels of communication controlled by an institution of higher education, and the use of funding sources generally made available to student organizations and student government. So this is essentially how public institutions are required to recognize freedom of speech as a fundamental right. So your Texas Senate Bill 18, institutions of higher education must and may ensure common outdoor areas of the institution's campus deemed for public forums, permit any person to engage in expressive activities in those areas of the institution's campus freely, as long as conduct is not unlawful or disrupts the functioning of the institution, may impose reasonable restrictions on the time, place, manner of expressive activities, may not take action against a student organization on the basis of political, religious, philosophical, ideological, or academic viewpoints. So essentially, this is what Texas Senate Bill 18 allows for in terms of campus free speech. So this is your works cited entry, Texas Senate Bill number 18. Can a person who works for a private company accuse the company of violating their First Amendment rights if the person chooses to walk off the job in protest? Can public employees, including faculty and staff members, utilize their First Amendment rights by taking off work to join a protest? And then can students use their First Amendment rights to disrupt the normal operations of an institution? So special topics, choose one: teacher walkouts and free speech legislation. So as you critically read the sample arguments and or events, note the argument that is evoked from each. It may be difficult to decipher the argumentative thesis. Therefore, consider the purpose for why an individual and or organization would protest using a particular medium and or tool. Think about your larger argument where one of these special topics might fit. So we have teacher walkouts, public, private. So employees in the public sector who work for government entities have First Amendment rights in their workplace subject to certain restrictions. Teacher walkouts. Employees in the private sector do not have constitutional freedom of speech and do not have First Amendment protection for speech in the workplace. So, in other words, if you decide to walk out from your private sector job, you do so at your own risk. As an American citizen, you have the right to free speech, but within different contexts, you don't have the same rights as a public employee, um, a government employee. Teacher walkouts as arguments, so prevention or intervention or critical thinking. Prevention or intervention. So employees who work for public institutions have a free speech right to engage in protest or take time off by state to engage in protest with conditions, but walking off the job is suspect. Critical thinking, you would need to conduct further research by state to determine complete and or restricted free speech rights for public employees. You would also need to determine union rules for those public employees subject to union guidelines. So not only do you have a federal constitution right, but you also have a right under as a public employee. But then you have to think about the union that you are part of. So those are three categories of laws that you have to make sure you have an understanding of before you make a decision to protest or march. Special topics arguments. So you must look beyond the argument to determine what each actor is suggesting. Ask yourself the following questions as you consider integrating a special topic in your papers. Why can't the battle for change and our freedom be won simply on merit without distracting elements? Why are people and organizations afraid of building the work ethic towards change? Meaning, these two questions are questions that I really pose, that if you care about change so much, why do you feel like you need to walk off the job? A job that is paying you, no less. But you feel like you have to walk off a job to bring about change, right? So why can't you take a course, a legal course, contracts course, any type of course, and learn about the law? Take some history courses, things like that, and then learn about how to bring about change. But walking off the job, especially as a teacher, when you did not learn how to walk off a job when you were enduring your education, is very suspect to me. So this is your works cited entry. Knowledge check. Why is it important to challenge your own arguments? Why is it important to research and understand the conditions and restrictions of free speech? So conclusion, the heart of the issue. So at the heart of the issue is slacktivism and lack of pursuit of mastery defined as a learning goal orientation. Raising raising awareness, whether at the individual and or organizational level, is not enough to bring about the long-lasting legislative change to address and resolve police violence based on race and or culture, sexual violence, sexual harassment, and or attacks against police officers in blue. As you consider your own advocacy intentions and efforts, in addition to your knowledge base, determine also whether you are effective at getting things done or functioning as an armchair activist hoping for change. Do you care about pursuing mastery in this area? In other words, if you're going to make a decision to march and protest, it's not that you need to go out there and march and protest. The first step that you need to do is to become a student of what you want to master, Otherwise, don't take on that particular decision, because it's going to have damaging effects for you. Because once you leave that marching ground, you still have to live your everyday life. And if you're not passionate about a particular topic or issue, then this is not the time for you to participate or contribute in any way until you do become passionate about it. So your works cited, alphabetical order, resources follow. So please be sure to use the title works cited in your papers. That should be the last page. You must use all required source materials, refer to eCampus. The references are part of this lecture and are titled accordingly. Resources are not required. So these are references for my lecture. But when you type your paper and your last page, it should be titled works cited. So references in terms of the Pew Research Center, the Gretchen Carlson, no, you're not going to use this works cited entry because it comes from the textbook. So make sure to use the vanity article that's housed on eCampus. And then equity for Time's Up, and then information about freedom of speech in the workplace. Then the Blue Lives Matter. Don't forget to change your access dates. And then, of course, the about. I went on ahead and added the variety article here for the Gretchen Carlson, so I changed my access date, and then Texas Senate bill. And then these are just resources. You haven't been exposed to the Alton Weiler piece that is on my own personal research and development, but you do know about Carol Dweck's changing our mindset chart. So this is Are Protests Obsolete audio lecture.